So welcome everyone to the sixth and final episode of Uprooting the Structural Drivers of Health Inequity series. Today we'll cover policy solutions to advance housing justice. My name is Gregory Miao. I'm a senior attorney at ChangeLab Solutions, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. Next slide, please. I want to go over a few quick notes before we get started. First, this event is being recorded and will be posted on ChangeLab Solutions website within the next week. You will all also receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording once it's ready. The chat function is open, and we encourage you to share any reactions or engage with each other throughout this webinar. If you have questions that you specifically want to submit to the speakers, please use the question and answer function. And if you'd like to join us in live tweeting during the event, we invite you to use the hashtag Uprooting Inequity. Next slide, please. So to start off, we'd love to meet you all. If you could drop your name, where you're tuning in from, your affiliation or organization, and what brought you here into today's conversation in the chat, we would love that. I also want to let everyone know that a live transcription option is available for today's session. In your Zoom window, you should see a button that says Live Transcript pictured here on the slide. If you click on that, you'll have the option to either show or hide subtitles. You can also adjust the font size to fit your preferences under subtitle settings. Our colleague Pernard Lim is helping us ensure all the tech runs smoothly today. So if you have any technical issues, you can send him a direct note via Zoom. So ChangeLab Solution works across the nation to advance equitable laws and policies that ensure healthy lives for all. We are an interdisciplinary team of lawyers, planners, and policy analysts and public health practitioners and other professionals. We collaborate with community-based organizations, local and state government, and anchor institutions such as hospitals and universities. Our objective is to create thriving, just communities. Our priority is assisting communities whose residents are at the highest risk for poor health. Our strength lies in using tools of law and policy in a collaborative, multifaceted, and cross-sectoral way. This ensures that policy solutions are both practical for governments, systems, and institutions, and meaningful for the people they are meant to help. ChangeLab also works with changemakers to improve their knowledge and capacity to use law and policy to change systems, policies, and practices to advance health equity. Today's webinar is the final installment of our six-part series, Uprooting the Structural Drivers of Health Inequity. So far, we've discussed the structural drivers of inequity, how government, community organizations, and philanthropy are reimagining their approaches in the context of the pandemic, economic crisis, and growing movement for racial justice. From there, we covered equitable enforcement of employment laws, systemic racism in education, embedding equitable community engagement in decision-making and planning, and policy solutions for a values-based food system. Today, we'll discuss the roots of systemic and racial discrimination in the housing system and how it shows up today, and local policy solutions that can advance housing justice. Next slide. I'm thrilled to introduce the panel of speakers who will be engaging in this conversation today. We have Kristen Mon, Director of Housing Development and Incentives at the Tulsa Authority for Economic Opportunity, Nestor Davidson, the Albert A. Walsh Chair in Real Estate, Land Use, and Property Law, and Director of the Urban Law Center at Fordham University School of Law, and Zach Newman, Co-founder and Executive Director of the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project in Colorado. I'm also excited about how much interest we have in today's discussion. We had over 700 registrants from 46 states and the District of Columbia. It looks like we have almost 300 online right now. So I just have a few slides I'll run through now to set the context for our discussion today. To start, I want to clarify that shrinking gaps in health outcomes differs from trying to improve public health overall. For example, reducing disparities in lead poisoning rates versus removing discrimination from the systems and structures that cause disparities in lead poisoning rates in the first place. It's a complex objective that requires new thinking and strategies for action. Rather than focusing on reducing the prevalence of any single disease, the challenge is finding ways to change the distribution of healthy environments, economic resources, and opportunities. Finding such solutions requires a fundamental shift in how policy is used to promote health. These 5 fundamental drivers are forces that create health disparities. For decades, public health's approach to improving health has been to move upstream, that is, to address the root causes of health problems. For example, public health efforts have focused on preventing obesity and heart disease by creating environments that support physical activity and provide access to healthy food. But despite many successes, health outcomes for some populations have not improved enough. In fact, in some cases, health disparities have increased at alarming rates. Policies and practices at every level have created these barriers to good health. We need to work together to alter the systems that keep inequity in place. Policies and practices at every level of government, The first driver I'd like to talk about is structural discrimination, which operates as a macro level driver that influences the other 4 fundamental drivers of health inequity. Structural discrimination operates through policies, cultural norms, and institutional practices, and occurs when systems, rather than individuals, unjustly deny wealth, opportunity, power, or government representation through racism, sexism, ableism, or classism. For example, even with the passage of fair lending laws, limitations in government, housing, and home ownership policies driven by local, state, and federal regulations continue to leave BIPOC communities out of housing stabilization and generational wealth generating opportunities. Next slide. The second driver I want to highlight is income inequality and poverty, which occurs when some people or groups experience disparities in income and wealth generation and is tightly tied to structural discrimination. This is critical because wealth determines whether families and communities can access and afford the basic resources and services that people need to lead healthy lives, like housing, heating, and food. Laws and policies play a central role in both concentrating wealth among the wealthy, making it difficult for the poor to escape poverty. For example, historical housing policies such as redlining, the systemic denial or selective raising of prices of financial services for residents in predominantly low and moderate income or African American neighborhoods, have systemically excluded Black communities and other communities of color from generational wealth opportunities, with typical homeowners in previously redlined neighborhoods gaining only 52% or 52% less in property value increases than a typical homeowner in a neighborhood that was not historically redlined. And these policies that contributed to income inequality and poverty have health consequences. For instance, a study by the Kirwan Institute found that people who lived in formerly redlined areas of Cleveland had higher rates of exposure to lead and toxic waste, infant mortality rates 5 to 6 times higher than those in non-redlined areas, and a 15-year reduction in life expectancy. Next slide. So I'll wrap up quickly by saying that systemic discrimination in housing policy really drives health inequity in 3 primary ways. First, it drives where people can find housing, inequitably limiting access to health supporting resources and opportunities such as green space, grocery stores, and school systems, and increasing exposures to things like violence and pollution. Second, it drives what kind of housing people can find, leading to inequitable exposures to poor physical housing conditions such as toxics, lead, pests, poor air quality, and poor heating and cooling. And third, it drives how much people pay for that housing, leading to the inequitable experience of overcrowding, homelessness, and trade-offs between food, heating, and other basic needs. And with that, I would like to bring us to our panel discussion. Great. Thank you, everyone. I want to go to build off that overview of the structural drivers. And I want to acknowledge that the history and perpetuation of structural discrimination has really had a big impact on our housing system. My first question is for you, Kristen, because Tulsa has its own history of dealing with the impacts of structural discrimination on housing, stemming from the 1921 race massacre. Could you help ground some of what was just covered in the experience of your city?
Absolutely. I think that as we talk about each of those elements, they're very evident when we talk about how the city of Tulsa dealt with the 1921 race massacre initially. So as a little bit of historical background for those who aren't aware, on June 1st, 1921, Tulsa was the site of the single worst act of racial violence in our country's history. As many as 300 people died. The Black Wall Street, the most prominent and wealthiest Black neighborhood in our country, was destroyed. About 35 square blocks were destroyed, $1.5 million in real estate, and over $750,000 in personal property. As the city addressed how to recover, it didn't do so very well. When we look at our history books, we see every single one of the elements that Greg just mentioned. So for example, the homeowners and the business owners weren't able to access the capital that they needed to rebuild. And they weren't able to regain the capital from what they'd lost because their insurance claims were overwhelmingly denied. It's estimated there's $1.8 million in insurance claims that were denied. So then they looked to the city and other resources that they could use to get the funds to rebuild. However, the city of Tulsa actually turned away funds from other municipalities that could have been used to help them rebuild, instead saying Tulsa needed to be responsible for itself. But unfortunately, the actions that a lot of leaders at the time took actually undermined the efforts to rebuild. One of those that I think is a really good example of when we talk about disparities in racial or in political power was they passed an ordinance that incorporated the Black Wall Street neighborhood into the city of Tulsa's fire codes. Now, on its surface, that's a really neutral ordinance, but because of what it imposed in terms of building materials and restrictions on building size, it had the effect of preventing people from being able to rebuild their homes and businesses. Now, that was overturned 3 weeks later, considered to be an unconstitutional taking of property. But that's just an example of the uphill battle that the residents who lost everything had to face. And I think that now, 100 years later, that's something the city of Tulsa is actively dealing with. Part of my role at the Tulsa Authority for Economic Opportunity, we are an economic and community development authority, and we're very focused on racial equity. A huge part of that is looking at our city and understanding that these are not just scars, but open wounds that even 100 years later are very deeply felt, not just by the residents of North Tulsa, but by every citizen as we look at our community and want to do better, want to know better. And I really appreciate being parts of discussions like this, because we do need to look at each one of those elements and say, how was it done before and how can we do it differently? So an example of that being, that disparities of political power. How are we ensuring that the residents of communities like North Tulsa have a voice in determining how we are able to move forward, and not just an illusion of inclusion where we ask people what they like, but that they are part of that political process that determines how we move forward.
Thanks, Kristen. Zach, I'm going to move to you next because I appreciate the historical context that Kristen's provided, but you're working right now at the nexus of COVID-19 and the housing system. So I'm curious to sort of bring us to the present. How do you see the sort of structural discrimination, both inside and outside of the housing system, impacting the people you're working with to try to keep them in their homes?
Yeah, Greg, thanks for the question. So we're the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project based in Denver, Colorado, and I saw some Denver people in the chat, so good to see you guys. We do a couple of things. We provide legal services to folks who are at imminent risk of eviction. We provide rental assistance, and then we also provide organizing and a bit of data and research as well. I think the data right now couldn't be clearer. U.S. Census Bureau shows that people of color in the United States are almost doubly likely to be at imminent risk of eviction, to be in debt on their rent, or to be facing some other form of housing instability. This isn't entirely surprising given the fact that, prior to the pandemic, people of color in the United States were disproportionately rent burdened. So I think that's kind of the ingoing experience that a lot of our clients are having. I think what's more telling, or what's kind of more salient for us as a project that seeks to keep people in their homes is a few things. One, inordinate number of our clients are just not aware that benefits are available. We see very real disparities in awareness of benefits. Urban Institute has done some great research to capture this at the national level, but in our day-to-day work, it's an inequity we see. I think the other thing is technological access or application access. It is easier to access an application for rental assistance or for legal services in some parts of the city than in other parts of the city. I think this is a very common feature of rental assistance in a lot of parts of the U.S., but I think it's especially pronounced where we work and operate. I think another is preferred language access. Obviously, if you are not filling out an ERA application in your first language, it's especially challenging. Frankly, it's challenging if you're doing it in your first language, as a lot of people have probably caught on to at this point, but it's a really difficult process. And then the final thing we see is that there's a real disparity in access to a navigator or a lawyer. And so ERA is one thing, getting the benefit of the bargain in the use of ERA dollars is another. And so another kind of salient feature that we see on the ground every day is that clients often are lacking that lawyer, that navigator who can ensure that once the money is paid to their landlord, they're actually able to stay in their homes. It's not just landlord debt service. And I think there's a racial lens on this, there's a neighborhood lens on this, and we really see that inequity every day in our work. So can go a bit deeper, but as an opening kind of remark, I would say that's kind of what we're working through every day at the project.
Thanks, Zach. I want to sort of follow up with you just really quickly on that. And I also want to sort of get your take on the role of the work that you are doing to prevent sort of perpetuation of structural racism within the housing system. Sort of, could you go a little bit more into sort of what eviction diversion is and how that is a supportive policy or end goal towards improving housing justice?
Yeah, so I think, in Colorado, there's no formal eviction diversion program. These vary by state and by county around the country, but generally speaking, it's not something that's existed in Colorado. Our program seeks to do a few things. It seeks to give clients first access to rental assistance negotiated on a fair basis and then paid out to their landlord. And then when that's unsuccessful, to make a referral to an attorney in our project who can represent that client. And so what we see is that in 70 or 80% of the cases, money is enough. In those cases where it's not enough, we pass that client through to an attorney who can represent them. But again, I think disproportionately to the national population, disproportionate to the Colorado population, we represent and work with renters of color who are more likely to be in rental debt or at risk of eviction, or alternatively, and this is just starting to emerge in our data, but it's worth pointing out, more likely to face eviction when they are in debt to their landlords relative to white renters. And so eviction is a tool used against renters of color much more frequently than it is used against white renters when they are at equal points in kind of the debt to landlord journey.
Thanks, Zach. Nestor, I want to turn to you now. So as we've previously mentioned, and as Kristen and Zach have helped illustrate, sort of, we have a long history of laws and policies at all levels of government that have both entrenched structural discrimination in the housing system, but there's also been laws that have attempted to dismantle the barriers of structural discrimination. There have been sort of equity promoting laws. Since you're the law professor here, I was hoping you might be able to share a little bit about our current, the status of our current housing policy landscape, particularly in light of sort of, what I think we all know are ebbs and flows in terms of how the government approaches its equity relationship. How are we doing right now, or where are we now? And what are some of the biggest legal barriers to adopting equity promoting housing policies?
It's obviously a very big question, Greg, and let me see just in our introduction if I can slice a couple of pieces of it. So the first is to recognize in housing policy, as in so many other areas of the intersection between structure and law, that the government is a they, not an it. And so one of the dynamics that's really important to understand is the interplay between the federal government, state governments, and local governments in this space. And sometimes that interplay works well, and you have programs where local expertise and federal funds and a state regulatory structure are all aligned, and that can advance equity, but often there's a misalignment. And so we can talk a little bit more about preemption and where states have interfered with local authority to advance equity, and the reverse, where local governments have taken actions in exclusionary zoning and other areas that have been a barrier to equity and the role of states and the federal government there. But I do think it's important to recognize that statutes like the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968, we're a little past the 50th anniversary, were an attempt, interestingly, to address both individual discrimination and to get at its the structures that drive segregation, that drive inequitable access to opportunity, that deal with the questions that you raised, Greg, in your opening about location, about quality of housing, about cost. And particularly on that structural side of the Fair Housing Act, I think it's fair to say we really haven't made nearly as much progress as the founders, the framers of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 intended. You know, there was a provision, there were actually two provisions in the Fair Housing Act that committed the federal government to bringing to bear all of its programs for housing and urban development to affirmatively further the purposes of the Fair Housing Act. And initially, Governor Romney was the Secretary of HUD when it was first passed early in the Nixon administration, really took it seriously, but it's a very blunt tool. And the remedy, if grantees of HUD are not advancing equity, is to withhold funding. And that's a really an outcome that can undermine the goal of equity that's trying to serve. And so it has remained in the background during the Obama administration. After a period of 7 years of policy development, the Obama administration put out a framework for HUD grantees to undertake a planning process, to use HUD supplied data and local knowledge to really look at patterns of segregation and integration, patterns of access to opportunity, other patterns of disparity, and plan and act iteratively over time. During the Trump administration, that was put on hold, and there was an attempt made to withdraw it, but the Biden administration has now put that process back in place. So we're just beginning to see what that is going to look like. But I think it does hold some promise to realign that the levels between the federal government, state governments, local governments, around a common set of goals, around a common framework, and around intentionality about acting. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in coming years, but I think it's a very promising, fairly overarching structural response.
Thanks, Nestor. I want to sort of turn that question then over to maybe Kristen, you next. But both you and Zach are working sort of within this state structures and federal structures. And I'm curious to hear, sort of as Nestor provided the overview of what some of the challenges might be, what are the challenges that you all are facing in trying to sort of advance your work as it relates to improving, housing equity within your communities?
Well, I can say my most significant challenge is State Question 759. So in 2012, a constitutional amendment was adopted in Oklahoma that prohibits affirmative action and specifically prohibits public contracting that has a racial preference. So I think that has created some challenges. Also, I will say not just in what we accomplish, but also in our community engagement. I'll give an example of home ownership. So white Tulsans are 2 times more likely to be homeowners than Black Tulsans. So one of the most obvious ways to address that would be to create a home ownership program that serves people of color in the city of Tulsa. However, as an economic development authority, that would be engaging in public contracting that has a racial preference. So internally, we know we can't do this. But when we engage with the community at large, the average person doesn't necessarily know that or appreciate that nuance. And it can put us in a struggle because we want to do the good work and advance racial equity. We're a bit handcuffed in how we can do that. but it also hurts our ability to engage with that broader community for them to truly believe that we are trying and fighting to do the best work that we can. Something I am very proud of that Tulsa has done has been taking some traditional approaches to problems like that. For example, using geographic areas and census tracts to focus our work by targeting communities that are predominantly non-white neighborhoods. However, in my mind, that's still not enough. If anything, we also have to address why we have majority non-white neighborhoods in the places that we do in the city of Tulsa. Every municipality should be looking at what its geographic and racial makeup is and why the map looks that way. And the last thing I think we are interested in doing is perpetuating the map looking that way. So something that we have done is work a lot with community partners and really bring everyone to the table to the extent we can. Explain, this is what we want to accomplish. These are what our limitations are. How can we come together to create a unified path forward? That's something we're also working with Change Lab Solutions on through the Housing Solutions Collaborative. I won't say we have the perfect answer yet. I don't know that anyone has the perfect answer. I don't know, maybe Nestor can tell me what it is. But I think that is something that I'm very grateful to see our community doing and other communities elsewhere doing, of saying, let's identify what our barriers is. And rather than throwing up our hands and saying, well, guess we can't do anything about it, saying, how can we be creative and how can we be creative with partners?
Nestor, did you hop off mute? Did you have something you wanted to add on there?
Well, two things. One, first, Kristen, to echo how important it is to center the communities you're working with. And that's a theme I think we're seeing all over the country, right? That one of the elements of this AFFH policy that I had mentioned was trying to revive and reimagine how community engagement would happen. So that it's not a box checking exercise, right? So that there's actually the voices of the community that are going to be affected by policies that so often just take place in distant federal or state capitals, right? Really are centered in the conversation. But I also want to underscore the experience you've had in Oklahoma and raise that up to a national audience for sort of creative thinking in advance, because I do think the legal landscape may be shifting in a direction that makes addressing the racial elements of equity a little bit more challenging. We have a Supreme Court that is committed to a vision of constitutionalism that is nominally colorblind, but that is really ahistorical. We now have an alignment post the Trump appointments to the Supreme Court, where we had a number of decisions when Justice Kennedy was still on the court that were decided by a 5-4 vote, where conscious acknowledgement and grappling with racial history and all of the questions, Kristen, you've talked about, and Greg, that are so much at the heart of this whole series, the government was still empowered to grapple with. And the constitutional amendment in Oklahoma, I think, and similar efforts in other states are really a preview of what is going to face people who are concerned about equity in a world in which any consideration of race as a matter of federal constitutional law will face really strict scrutiny in constitutional terms. And I do think there are creative solutions in a world in which the case law, the jurisprudence looks very different, but I do think it's something that thoughtful advocates really need to be considering now, and places, Kristen, the work you're doing can be models. But I do think we as a collective community concerned about health and housing equity really do need to be thinking about it now and not after those decisions come down in coming years.
Thanks, Nestor. Zach, I want to turn that question over to you a little bit, and maybe we'll just reframe it slightly. I'm curious, in your work on sort of eviction prevention, what are the biggest barriers you see at the state level? And I'm curious to the extent, I know it's a big question, but I guess where I'm going with this is that, I think that there's been a lot of work happening, and in fact, it feels to me like this is a very new area in many ways for organizations to be inhabiting, in terms of really building out more robust eviction prevention efforts. And one of those organizations, of which is yours. And what I see when I look at the law is that, and maybe Kristen, you could actually hop in here as in addition, is that the laws are really structured around eviction in a very unfair, uneven manner. Whether it's the sort of expedited processes for eviction filings or just the structure of the unlawful detainer laws that we have. And I'm curious sort of what your experience has been with that in Colorado.
Yeah, I'm laughing over here because I could talk for the next hour about all of this. I'll touch on some state items and maybe some federal items as well. I think at the state level, we're optimistic. A group of community organizations, including ours, just passed SB 173, which will go into effect on October 1st. This pretty significantly changes the timeline on the eviction process. It adds more time and more steps for renters. It adds more defenses. It caps late fees. And most significantly, it extends the cure period up until the moment of judgment. And so what that means is that if in the back end we're racing to get rental assistance to someone, if that money arrives even at the last possible moment, we can avoid the eviction. And so we think that will be incredibly helpful once it's online. I think longer term, we believe in this model of very rapidly processed emergency rental assistance paired with legal services. I think right now we really continue to struggle with the intersection of federal policy as interpreted by state and county agencies. And we manage a number of different county and state funds related to emergency rental assistance. And for each of those different entities, there is a different set of guidelines, a different set of reporting. There's a different way in which we as a nonprofit organization are paid. And I put quotes around paid because sometimes it's payment per application, sometimes it's reimbursement for services, sometimes it's not paid at all. But I think the net effect of that is that you create a lot of bureaucracy around money that needs, by definition, to get out the door on a timeline because the eviction timeline has a very specific deadline. And so while we're optimistic about 173, I think if we could change anything, it would be moving those federal dollars a lot more quickly. And as we build this national infrastructure to administer rental assistance, ensuring that organizations like ours that are doing this work are actually able to kind of get money to tenants, reimburse against that money, get paid per services if that's part of the deal, and continue to operate their organization. But right now, it's a very difficult thing to do, and I think very much an evolving process.
Great, thanks, Zach. I'm really interested in this question. I'm curious to hear the panel's, other members of the panel's thoughts on this, because I think, sometimes when we talk about structural discrimination within a system, it's a very clear link, right? So there are either, not, just explicitly discriminatory policies that were passed in the, that in the past that have sort of had a historical consequence and created sort of generational wealth gaps and things of that nature. There's also structural discrimination within process. And I think that's what why I think it's a really interesting question, because, I think what we've heard, and Kristen, I think you've talked about this, is that, particularly within, say, the eviction crisis that we're sort of facing right now, a lot of those structures are really, the legal structures are really oriented towards remedy for landlords, right? And there's a power imbalance in how they're written, and they're sort of written neutrally a lot, but sort of within the timelines and within some of the burdens of proof and things of that nature, a lot of the power imbalance is created. And so I'm curious to hear from you all, we just heard about that a little bit within the context of Zach's work. If there are other barriers that you see out there in your work that have that more sort of procedural power imbalance as part of them.
Well, I think one that I tend to highlight a lot when we talk about power imbalance has to do around housing quality. So Oklahoma is one of 7 states without an anti-retaliation statute. So what that means is that a landlord can retaliate by raising rent, decreasing services, or just removing a tenant who reports unsafe housing conditions. Unfortunately, we've seen that on a mass scale in the last month at an apartment complex known as Vista Shadow Mountain, where we had over 100 households become homeless due to a landlord's failure to maintain a property. I will say it's some of the most horrifying conditions I've ever seen, down to missing walls. You could walk from one unit to another. And a question I was asked quite frequently, and by local policymakers, by stakeholders, and even just members of my own community who knew who I was and would walk up to me and say, how did this happen? Why didn't the tenants tell someone? And I repeat, they would be retaliated against. They did not have that power in order to be able to safely call the Tulsa Health Department or our Working in Neighborhoods Code Enforcement and say, my housing conditions are unsafe. I need you to come do an inspection. Because if they even allowed the inspection, let's say they didn't call, but code enforcement came and the tenant let them in, then that landlord could retaliate against them. We're at 95% occupancy and have a shortage of 3,000 affordable units. There's a very practical reality that these tenants did not have anywhere to go and were jeopardizing their own safety and well-being. So I think when we talk a lot about the structure, what allows a system or things that aren't working well to remain the way they are, that's always one I point to, a need for tenants to be empowered to report things like unsafe housing conditions. Because I will say, one of the programs I love to highlight, I work with so many great landlords through things like our Gold Star Landlord program, our Safe and Healthy Homes program at the Tulsa Health Department. But our overall housing quality stock always gets dragged down by those. And it continues to operate and will continue to take place in a way that we can't touch when the tenants are disincentivized and even threatened in order to improve them.
Thanks, Kristen. So I want to pivot us a little bit, since we've talked a lot about some of the challenges, whether they are, laws that are explicitly difficult and banning sort of affirmative action style programming, or there are, some of the barriers built within just even how those, neutral laws are structured and who has power sort of within that. And I want to pivot us a little bit more then towards, I think, Nestor, what you were getting to at your intro, which is, what are some of the sort of more promising solutions that we have? I think, one area might be sort of restructuring some of our existing laws. Zach, you talked a little bit about that. But, I know that you briefly touched on AFFH, or affirmatively furthering fair housing. Are there other policies that you see sort of in your role that could be sort of promising for locals to pass?
Yes, so I do think we're having a really interesting policy conversation across multiple sectors in housing. And I think one of the things to say at the outset is that there's a growing recognition of how interconnected these all are. And that's really important. So when you talk about people who are unhoused, you have to think about access to attorneys in eviction proceedings, right? If you think about the context in which housing precarity plays out, you have to think about supply questions, right? How do we build housing? What's the role of zoning in that? What's the role of building codes, right? And that may be obvious, but I think it's something we haven't really fully appreciated. It's far too easy to get siloed, even in a world that is as circumscribed as housing policy. There are all sorts of silos within that world. So I think in many ways, the most promising policies are those that recognize how interconnected it all is. And I think there's a growing recognition that we have to tackle supply problems, especially in high cost cities and in places where affordability drives, places like Denver, along the coast. I am sure this is true in parts of Tulsa as well. But I do think also taking a pretty explicit, to the extent that we still can, equity lens, a racial equity lens, if we can, so that we can recognize the history, the legacy, but also think about policies that take that into account. And AFFH, which I mentioned, I think is really promising. And I think we're going to see a tremendous investment from the Biden administration in advancing that. President Biden signed an executive order in January, one of his first executive orders for a sort of whole of government approach to equity. They're embedding chief equity officers in all of the most important agencies that deal with these issues. The kind of challenge that Zach talked about multiple funding streams and inconsistent requirements, and that's an endemic problem. It has been forever in housing policy. I think there are bottom-up solutions to that, but I think there actually has to be top-down solutions as well. And so I think there is a nascent effort and again, I'm not in the administration, but following things closely, there's a nascent effort to begin to coordinate a little bit better so that the burden doesn't fall entirely on providers at the bottom end of multiple funding streams to be able to coordinate. That if you can coordinate more at the top level and also recognize the interplay, not just within housing policy, but also between housing and health, so that people are getting the services they need. That's another big challenge we haven't really talked about is how you do service enriched housing. Those are completely different systems. And we all know this at the local level. Certainly, there's an awareness at the federal level that the systems that HHS and other agencies like that create don't sync at all with the systems that HUD creates. And that is a massive structural challenge that has to be solved both from the bottom up and from the top down.
Thanks, Nestor. Kristen, I want to sort of turn this over to you quickly to sort of get your input on, I think Nestor was talking a little bit about bringing this intersectoral approach to housing and understanding sort of how housing quality laws impact housing affordability laws and, how that impacts, housing stability programs like eviction defense programs. And, I think we've had some conversations before, and I'd love for you to tell me a little bit more about what Tulsa's approach has been because I think you have a unique approach in trying to layer some of your programs together. And I know you're working within some constraints of what you're allowed to do, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the promising policies that you've identified and how you might have layered them on top of each other or together.
Yes, I think my favorite example of this is the City of Tulsa's Gold Star Landlord program. So I've talked about, of course, one of our worst actors in the City of Tulsa. But we had a very conscious decision that we wanted to work with the landlords who were really engaging in what the best rental practices were. And we really wanted to promote that. And I think from a policy standpoint, that prompted an interesting discussion of what are the best rental practices. And we took a very collaborative approach to that. And it also provided a unique opportunity for us to engage across programs. So when we launched the City of Tulsa's Gold Star program, it is a free and voluntary program that provides rewards and incentives for landlords who engage in the best rental practices and requires that they participate in 4 programs. This let us work with some partners who already had standalone programs. So again, as we talk about funding and administration, I think one of the reasons that we were able to effectively do this is we were able to essentially consolidate all of the good work that was already being done and create a pathway to engage with all the programs. So that included the Tulsa Health Department Safe and Healthy Homes program, which launched in 2019. It is also a free and voluntary program that landlords can get free code inspections of vacant rental properties before they rent them out. It also comes with its own incentives like free lead testing. And then we were also able to engage with our early settlement mediation program, which provides free mediation services. Landlords who participate in Gold Star agree that they will request mediation prior to filing an eviction. Our mediation program is fully funded through Tulsa County and our Oklahoma Supreme Court. And something I love to quote about them is that they have a 75% settlement rate. And of those cases that settle, 94% of the settlements are successful. So we have a wonderful mediation program, and yet it was being very underutilized in that eviction context and by landlords. So that's where I think that the Gold Star program did something special in terms of all of our community partners being able to say, this is what I bring to the table. This is what I can contribute. This is how I can help the landlords and the tenants. And then we were able to put something together that I think really supports both the landlords and tenants, and in a way where no one agency, because as we all know, working, whether in a nonprofit context or for a municipality, no one person has to bear the full weight, and we can all move it forward together.
Thanks. Zach, I want to turn to you now quickly, because I think the Eviction Defense Project has an interesting history, right? It's a new organization. Or relatively new, that was, I think you created and helped create in direct response to the need brought on by COVID. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about sort of the opportunity that you saw or the need that you saw and the process that went into creating sort of a response organization and filling that gap, as well as, something that I think is very interesting about what you've done, which is really push for a new financing mechanism that lets you get money out the door a lot faster. And I'm curious if you could just tell us a little bit about why is that financing mechanism important for the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So, we started the project in April or May of last year. So we've recently celebrated our 1-year anniversary. And I think we started just doing cases. And of course, if you're operating in a construct like what existed in Colorado before SB 173, or my impression from Kristen's comments, kind of what the setup is in Oklahoma, usually you go to court as a tenant's attorney and you lose. Your job is to stand next to your clients, watch the judge bang the gavel and get out of there. I think we said we want to do this a little bit differently. So we engaged in some community organizing, worked on some policy, and really talked to our clients. And what they told us is a lot of the time this is happening because emergency rental assistance is not moving fast enough. And so we set up the organization and the program we have now, which has a capital revolver in-house of $2 to $3 million. When someone is at imminent risk of eviction, they get that lawyer, that navigator, depending on what their needs are. And then we're able to make payment from our fund really quickly, usually within 48 hours, once either the client has completed all the documents or is, relatively close to completing those documents. And we make those judgments based both on, the kind of the percentage of the documents complete and the risk there. And we make payment. And then we take it back to government to reimburse it after the fact. And that reimbursement can take anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks. But for us, that's been, a bit of a medium term or hopefully longer term solution to this issue of money not moving fast enough in these eviction cases. Now, I think longer term, though, where we'd like to take this is continuing to grow the revolver, doing the lawyers, but we need to take this to every community organization in Colorado. And I think that's how you ultimately address these equity problems in the eviction world. Right now, I would say if you don't find us online, or you aren't fast enough to go to the state or the county website, odds are you're not going to be able to cover that rental balance and you're going to face eviction. I think the future of this work is being a plug-in to trusted community partners, to churches, to community groups, to neighborhood organizations that can provide cultural translation, linguistic translation, that can help people interact with our staff. And so as we come out of COVID and as it's safer to interface with people, I think we want to take the revolver and our lawyers to trusted community partners and really come in as a plug-in or as an intersection with their work so that we can keep their members housed.
Thanks, Zach. I really wanted to have you share that with me because I think we got a couple of questions in prior during registration that sort of centered around sort of the struggle of utilizing program, right? And we sometimes have these federal programs that are set up and it can be really difficult to get people enrolled in them. And there are structural barriers to actually utilizing them, whether it's Section 8 or it's ERA. So I think the sort of innovation of creating a revolving loan fund that lets, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is it lets you essentially forward the money on behalf of the client so that they're paying their landlords very quickly, and you then carry the burden of seeking the reimbursement on behalf of the tenant. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you think, I mean, for us, it all comes down to like a question of risk. You think about, where risk should sit in the system. Shouldn't sit with the tenant, they're going to lose their home. Probably shouldn't sit with the landlord, especially if we're talking about a small independent operator. They're going to struggle to pay their mortgage. We can take that risk onto our books and we can make payment quickly, remove the risk from landlord and tenant, and then sit on that risk of delay or sit on that risk of a compliance problem. And sometimes we take losses. Our fund isn't batting 1,000. We do have cases we have to write down, but we have a loss fund in place. It's foundation backed, and really we're seeing loss at about 2 to 3%. And so, if you think about the speed that allows you across all of the cases for the amount of money you're paying in loss every month or every year, it's really not that significant in terms of what you're getting back and keeping people in their homes and getting that risk off of landlords and tenants' books.
Great. Yeah, I love that as like an innovative way to address some of the structural challenges that we face. Because I think we hear a lot, especially around eviction, that when the structure creates a known quantity around sort of how long it'll take to process the eviction, it actually creates a structure where landlords know what the cost is, right? They know how long it's going to take them. They know how much last rent they'll lose before they can release the place. And it creates this very strange dichotomy where if you can beat that loss by either getting them reimbursed faster or ensuring that they have some sort of knowledge or guarantee that they will get paid, it's a really powerful way to sort of intervene within that existing structure. So I just really appreciate that. So I want to, before we open this up to some of the questions that we've gotten in, and we've gotten quite a few, I just want to sort of leave us with a more open-ended question. And I really like these ones, so I hope you'll bear with me. But I'm curious, and this is to all panelists, what gives you some hope for the future of our housing system?
Well, I guess I'll start, which is one of the lessons of the pandemic is that crisis begets creativity. And we're hearing, obviously, some great programs. And I think there's so many other examples around the country, things that as somebody who watches housing policy very closely, I would have said 2 years ago would not have been possible. And part of that is just that there's much more recognition that funding is necessary and much more funding flowing into this sector. There's much more recognition of the ancillary consequences of not solving housing problems, right? I hope the Supreme Court upholds the CDC moratorium. It seems to me, eviction moratorium, it seems to me eminently logical that once you understand what public health is, of course, you're going to have to deal with eviction. But you can look at things like, in New York City, purchasing hotels that were long-term facilities to warehouse people and turning that into a permanent affordable housing, and programs like that around the country. That it's as though the space crisis has created the space for solutions that might not have seemed possible even very, very recently. So that actually gives me hope, even though the challenges are equally great.
I have been very excited about opportunities to work with partners outside of just the housing space, because there's a greater understanding of the interconnection between things. Tulsa, in addition to as part of our housing crisis, we have the 11th highest eviction rate in the country. And I have had more conversations with people outside of our typical housing realm, outside of the people we usually see at the table, engaging me in conversations about the interconnection between a lack of affordable housing supply, leading to cost burden renters, leading to evictions, leading to homelessness, and leading to poor education outcomes for children who are constantly moving classrooms. And just each little bit of that is something I don't think I've had those conversations 2 years ago. I think that these are conversations I'm able to have now. And that makes me optimistic, because if someone whose passion maybe isn't housing like mine is, but is, reading outcomes, or is racial equity, or is healthcare outcomes, understanding that housing is part of their work and a willingness to engage on it, to me, that's just huge.
So, obviously agree a lot with what Nestor and Kristen said. Don't know if I have a lot to add. I'll speak locally to Colorado. I think in the local discourse, there was always talk of, racially imbalanced policies or the existence of racism in the administration of services. There was always talk of economic justice, but somehow housing never really fully came into that conversation. And I think what's been so compelling and what makes me so hopeful is that on both the economic justice vector and the kind of anti-racism vector now, you're really seeing housing come to the forefront. And so for us, that's things like SB 173 passing. It's the governor and the legislature, convening a task force this year to use all of the American Rescue Plan dollars to figure out affordable housing in the state. It's years now of gubernatorial EOs to keep people in their homes. And I don't know, I worked on this issue for a while. I don't think 3 years ago you would have seen that much policy progress. And so I think people now identify housing with these broader issues of equity, inclusion, or access. And I think that's really positive. And it gets me excited. And, again, in other states that may have been part of the conversation, but for Colorado, this is really revolutionary and it's change.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I really couldn't agree more. I would just add on that I really think that, especially when we talk about both the housing affordability conversation as well as the housing stability conversation, those are things that are just happening, at a much more elevated level, with much more concentration on, how to address those problems and the interconnectedness of those problems. So I'm going to turn us over then to a little bit of the Q&A and the questions that came in during our conversation, as well as a few of the ones that came in during the pre-registration. I'm curious to hear, and I know we don't have anyone who's directly speaking from a rural community here, but one of the areas, or certainly one community that faces unique and different struggles with housing are our rural and smaller communities. And I think there are probably a fair number of systemic challenges that they're facing as well. So I'm curious if any of you have how you see systemic discrimination impacting sort of smaller communities or rural areas, and what policy approaches might be promising for them.
Well, I love this question because prior to coming to Tulsa, I spent 7 years as a legal aid attorney in Southeast Kansas in a rural area and covered 12 counties. And I think some of the biggest challenges I saw around housing really mirrored a lot of the same problems that I see in mid-sized cities and large cities. And those can center around things like housing quality, and the need for resources to do things like code enforcement and inspection. I think that something that was maybe more unique is just true of rural areas, and I think small towns, that I know one of the biggest challenges I saw in court would be, I always put this as a joke, that I would ask what kind of tenant screening a landlord might do, because I was always checking my clients' credit reports. And they said, well, I called my buddy, which is true. If you've lived in a rural area, that's how it operates. So I think that one of the unique challenges in a rural area can be the need to engage with not just tenant advocacy or landlord advocacy, but it's community advocacy, where you need to really have everybody at the table and a plan to move forward. And I think while that's true in larger communities, I think that the stakes can be high in a rural community just because of the nature of how smaller communities like that operate.
That's the only thing I would add, and this is, as you point out, Greg, not an area that I work much in. I run an urban law center, so my focus is mostly in cities. But I do think it's also important to recognize the deep housing challenges in tribal communities as well. And that's a challenge across the country. And I think that doesn't get enough attention in the national policy conversation, and creative solutions from within Indian nations as well. But I think that needs to be equally, when we think about all the layers of government, when we think about local and state and federal, I think it's important to center tribes as well.
Thanks. I want to sort of build on this a little bit and really build on what you were talking about, Kristen, in terms of the community engagement and really supporting the community within the rural areas. Because I think there are also probably some parallels within the engagement of what those conversations look like with the engagement of BIPOC communities as well. So, oftentimes there are some similarities in terms of income levels, lack of resources, the challenge of new development versus sort of rent increase, right? So navigating some of those conversations. And so I'm curious, both in your role, Kristen, as sort of in economic development, how you approach that conversation with BIPOC community leaders. And Zach, I'm curious how you approach sort of the eviction conversation with BIPOC community leaders in Denver, because I imagine you're doing some similar work there as well.
Yes, well, I think a lot of times when I'm approaching those communities, I will say I approach it from the standpoint of where I want to work collaboratively, where I'm providing the resources to help the community achieve what it needs and help them achieve its vision. I don't see it as a top-down approach where I come in with my vision and my plan, from an economic development authority. So I always have to be very clear that I'm here to listen and I'm here to learn, and then I'm happy to help you achieve those goals. And then also being very transparent and honest about where my limitations are. And I give State Question 759 as an example, where I've absolutely sat down with leaders, told them I can't do something, and they hear can't as won't. And I completely understand why they do. So then it's a matter of communicating and sharing, these are what my limitations are. And then again, focusing on finding creative alternatives and ways around those limitations to get us where we need to go. So I think when it comes to approaching those community leaders, I try to envision myself as a collaborator. I think a good example of something in the city of Tulsa where we see that is outside of my office in the Tulsa Planning Office. We have a Vibrant Neighborhoods Partnership. And that is where the Tulsa Planning Office leads a 6-month planning process in a neighborhood that is led by a community organization. This is not the planning office telling the community, this is what you need. This is the neighborhood association or community organization saying, these are the things we want. The planning office helping them come up with a constructive plan and bring the resources to the table, for example, my programs, and then saying, this is how you can move it forward. And I think that is really essential when we're engaging with communities of color.
So there was a meeting in Denver a month or two ago. It's COVID time, so it all kind of blends together. But it was like Legal Aid and us and a bunch of community groups and representatives or pastors from a lot of the Black churches in Denver. And, a pastor pretty early on was like, look, we've been saying this is a problem for years. We've been working on it for years. You guys are pretty new to the party. It was addressed to everyone. And I think just now, at least in Colorado, a wider range of community groups are starting to grapple with this. And so I think there also, for us, needs to be an element of humility and of recognition that, maybe we haven't done the listening work before, that we haven't engaged in the right way. And I think, that's not a fun thing to say, and it's not a great reflection, but I think it's an important one to acknowledge in that setting and in this one. And so when we go into those meetings, I think it's one, listening, like Kristen said, and acknowledging that, there have been people who've been fighting this issue like hell for, a generation, and we're new to the party. And then I think the other thing is saying, look, we can do emergency rental assistance quickly. We've got lawyers who are pro bono. Those are the resources we bring. How do we help you? How do we support what you're doing? How do we plug in? How do we best serve your community? Let us shape this around what you need with those resources in mind, and take that feedback. And as you build the program with these community partners, getting that feedback as you go through. This isn't working for members. This is working. We need more of this, less of that. Maybe that sounds obvious, but I don't know. I think there hasn't been enough dialogue in this space. And I think that early point of feedback continues to stand out for me because it's meaningful. And I think it's something that often goes unsaid.
Thanks. So I think we will have one final question before we wrap up. But so I think we just talked a little bit about engaging in strategies to proactively work with communities that have been disparately impacted. I think one of the interesting things about housing space is that, and we've talked a little bit about before, is that while there's a lot of good work to be done with communities that have been disparately impacted, the structure that has created this disparate impact is actually one that's benefiting or disparately or affecting other communities. And I'll bring up zoning, for example, and single family zoning. And I'm curious to what extent you and your work are engaging with sort of that conversation around how do we more equitably distribute some of those, like the base levels of the housing system, so that that we're increasing access to high opportunity communities and high opportunity neighborhoods, as well as sort of removing some of those structural barriers that have led to the creation of concentrated pockets of disinvestment.
I would say something. So as Director of Housing Development, a huge area of focus for me is the implementation of our city's affordable housing strategy, and particularly addressing our shortage of affordable housing. When it comes to affordable housing, there is a high institutional knowledge barrier to building and creating affordable housing. While low-income housing tax credits are such a fantastic program, they're hard to do and require a lot of knowledge. So a big focus for us has been creating creative funding avenues and ways that we can support the development of affordable housing. But also, this goes to who's building it. We really want to create opportunities for our local developers, particularly those small businesses owned by people of color who have been shut out of a lot of those spaces, again, because it's not always just a question of capital. It's how do I navigate a, complex HUD-funded program that will allow me to create these structures. So you have at the City of Tulsa, I won't spend too long talking about it. This is where I could spend an hour discussing our Affordable Housing Trust Fund and resources that we've been creating focused on affordable housing production and preservation, but trying to create lower barrier opportunities and ways that we can support our local developers, but also working with our local CDFI, which is TEDC, and they are creating a program currently called Build Tulsa. And they plan to launch their next cohort in January of 2022. And it provides educational resources to teach business owners and teach developers how to become better developers, but also how to access that capital, how to be able to go to a bank and ask for $1 million and get that funding, but also layer that with its resources as a CDFI. So we're going to build up the local businesses to create that shortage, or to create the units we need to fill the shortage. So that was something I've seen that we've done that I have been very, very appreciative of, that it's not just a question of building it, but asking who's not building it yet and why, and what can we do to target those barriers.
Zach or Nestor, we have a couple of minutes left, so interested to hear what your thoughts you have on this.
Yeah, I guess I would shift back to one example that you gave, which is the conversation around zoning. And here again, I think we're seeing some interesting advances that didn't seem possible recently. And so I think there's, for example, a growing recognition about the implications of just what a phenomenal percentage of our zoning at the local level is single family. And so starting with Minneapolis, phasing out single family housing, and now Oregon and other jurisdictions looking at ways of, you have to be very careful about context, and you have to be very careful about making sure the infrastructure is there to build more housing. But there are many, many places where we could do much, much more density. And so if you want to think about a structural solution, that's one I'd love to see cities and states working collaboratively together. We do have a legacy, if you want to talk about the history of where race, we have a structure of local government power that was really ossified at a time of white flight from local governments. And so we have a kind of fractured metropolitan governance in most parts of the country. It creates all these incentives for these little islands to compete with each other, right? And so you have to think about how you do regional scale solutions and what the incentives can be for that. And that's, I think, a part of what the AFFH conversation is trying to push. But if the barriers still exist, that's the state's responsibility to step in and say we have to rationalize the incentives. Part of that is about how we fund local government. Why do we have exclusionary zoning? Because we have a property-based tax system for a property tax-based system for education. And so, where you live can be incredibly important to where your kids end up going to college. And so that drives these resource competitions. And we have to, again, link how we think about funding schools, how we think about funding public safety, to how we think about the zoning incentives. And I think ultimately that's the responsibility of the state to think about those structures, because the state created all of them.
Thanks, Nestor. I want to turn this to Zach really quickly, just for a final comment. I'm curious, since you are sort of a service provider for a disparately impacted community, if there is anything you see about your work or work that could be done with not the community you're working with, right? So in the zoning context, we talk about, developing affordable housing and not wanting to put it all in low-income communities. Is there a corollary, or do you see any overlap with how you could expand the eviction work to talk about, landlords or people expanding who could be landlords so that we have more access? I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think for us, the thing we're grappling with as an organization is what to do with our in-house stability fund. As we accumulate capital, do you spin that off as a CDFI to do broader community stability activities? Do you focus it just on ERA, but in certain communities post-COVID? I don't think we have good answers to that yet. I think, some may disagree with this, and this is very anecdotal, and I don't have great data to back it up, but I would say that our results and the indebtedness of our clients, the credit records of our clients, whether our clients stay housed, really ties deeply to the type of housing that they're living in. So obviously we'll second everything on zoning ordinances and density and fully in agreement, but I think the extent to which we can empower small landlords to own more properties and operate those community first, nonprofit owners, in some cases housing authorities, that goes a lot further in preserving our clients and ensuring they have long-term housing and credit stability, as opposed to large-scale private owners. I think everything about that interaction is different. And so if we could change one thing about Denver, it would be a lot less private equity ownership of housing in this city and a lot more nonprofit and community-focused ownership, because I think in the former case, you really do see a lot more evictions and a lot more credit impact. And so I don't know how that impacts our operations or what it means for kind of how we use our vehicle, but it's something we think about a lot.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that's a really great way for us to end our conversation, because I think all of the information says that small landlords and nonprofit landlords are our best landlords for the communities that need it the most. So I'm going to just wrap us up here. There's a couple final slides that we'll just go back to. So I just want to say thank you again to Kristen, Nestor, and Zach for your thoughts and for this amazing conversation. And I want to point folks to a few resources to continue learning. on your own. You can find the above resources on our website by going to the Healthy Neighborhoods Housing section. And I think our speakers have also recommended a few extra resources on the next slide for you to learn more as well. So this was the 6th and final episode of Uprooting the Structural Drivers of Health Inequity discussion series. I encourage you all, if you haven't seen any of the previous ones, to go back and view the previous episodes on the website at this link. Thank you all so much for joining.